Alright, now that I showed you how you can create your first material just by using colors, I would like to point that that is not just the only way to create materials, and you can create materials off of textures. And so I will, in this next few minutes, show you how you can create a brick material for a wall, and then I'll show you how to use textures for this purpose, and what different kinds of textures are and how you can use them to create materials. So first off, let me just create a if you click on my materials folder within the chapter 6 tutorial that you created, and right click in the gray area, you can create a new material. And for this new material, I will call this Matte My Brick Wall 01. Okay, now this will, remember again, create your material, your empty material, and if you had your material expression window closed, it will open your material editor. And in the material editor, you can press key 3 and left click to create a 3 vector, or you can right click and from constants click on constant 3 vector, and that would give you a constant 3 material. Now let's just move on and see what kind of things we have here. If you right click in the gray area, you can add new expressions or instructions, and each of these instructions or expressions are actually categorized in different categories here. So you can have color categorization, we will have a desaturation expression or a destination color. You can have constants. We worked with constant 3 vectors and constant vectors. You can create like vectors to add colors and stuff. And you can click on coordinates, and you can bring different kinds of coordinates: active world position, camera position, foliage impulse positions, directions, and so forth. You can also add panners and rotators. These will help you move on the material, move your texture on the material with the panner, or rotate the textures, and we'll see these things. You can add a new texture coordinate expression, and so forth. You can use custom expressions. You can define them yourself. Depth expressions, with the advanced materials, we'll see that you can create depth expressions to change the refraction values on the water materials, so the water would look murky as the deeper you go. And you can have different kinds of components. So look at them and read from about these values and these expressions and instructions from your book and the contents of your Unreal Network. But within the texture subcategory, you can bring a whole bunch of different components that relate to textures, and you can one of those is basically a texture sample. So if instead of creating a RGB color value, you can bring a new texture sample, and you can assign to this texture sample a texture. And texture is, again, if you remember, is just a 2-dimensional image, and that image will be your material texture. So if you want to create brick materials, you bring a brick texture. If you want to create grass materials, you bring grass texture, and so on and so forth. So let's bring a new texture sample. One way to bring new texture samples is basically to right click, go to texture, and click on new texture sample. Another way is to press the key T and left click, and that would bring the same texture sample as you see here. So let's just use one of these texture samples. Now, when you click on texture sample, and your texture sample is empty, and as you see here, it doesn't have a texture in it, and its description is empty. So you can give it a description. For example, diffuse texture, and then you can add a texture to it. To add a texture to this texture sample, you need to go to your your content browser, and here is the content browser, and then click on the chapter 6 materials, and then click on textures. And when you click on textures, you will see that you have three texture components here. You have a texture, stone block, dark. You have a stone blocks normal, and then you have a flame texture. For now, well, let's forget about flame texture. We want to create a brick wall, so we need to add a wall texture to your material. And I will show you what the difference the normal texture here makes as opposed to the actual brick texture. The brick texture is like the color of the material, and the normal texture has the normal values for each pixel. So when normal texture is rendered under the Phong shading lighting, then you will see the crevices on the texture. So normal texture is supposed to give you that three-dimensional look. So if you left click on the texture 2D wall stone blocks, and then you go back to your material expression and choose a texture sample, you will see this green arrow that says use selected object in the content browser. When I left click on it, as you see here, the texture is applied to my texture sample. And when I left click and drag the output of the texture sample, the black output here, to the diffuse component, it will give me the RGB values of the texture sample to the object here. So here's how my texture basically looks like. If I move and rotate around, you'll see how my object looks like here. Okay? So what you need to do here is to notice that the artist that created this texture sample, they have a red value for each pixel, a green value for each pixel, and a blue value for each pixel. And they also have the alpha value or the transparency value that ranges between 0 and 1 for each pixel. And this black node at the top of the texture sample is made of RGBA, or the full color values of your texture. And here's how it looks like. Now let me save this value and go to the content browser and click on your materials, and then click on the materials here. Now here you see that my material has been saved. So I right click on my package and I save the package. And now let's go to our viewport and see how it looks like. I'll minimize this, and then I'm going to create a world. And then within this world, let's just go ahead and add a light by holding L and left clicking, and then I'll use the orthographic viewports to position the light in a place that lights up the room. And then I'll right click on the surfaces and I select all surfaces, and then go to the content browser one more time, click on the materials, click on your matte material that you created, right click on the surfaces and apply your material. Now here you will see how your materials now look like. Now if you build the lighting, you'll see how your room looks like. Okay, so here's the view of the room under the light and with the texture. The texture is a little bit dark here. You can lighten up your texture by opening your material editor and multiplying the texture that you have here by some positive value, basically lighting up this the value. So left click on the texture sample, and while holding the control button, move it around. Now what you need to do here is to create a constant value and multiply that value to the texture sample and then apply the result. So what you can do is hold down the key number 1 and left click. That would bring you a constant value, and put a positive value like a 5 in it, and then right click in the gray area, and from the math subcategory choose multiply. When you choose the multiply value, a multiply comes in with two inputs, A and B. The multiply expression multiplies the values of A, which you can select it from the texture, to B, which you can select it from the constant that you created, and then you can create the output of this multiply to the diffuse texture. And as you see, the texture lights up a little bit. Once you save your texture, or the material, you'll see that the material automatically lights up in your viewport. So now you have a much lighter material, much brighter material for your texture, for your wall. So here's how the wall looks like. Now if you get close to the wall, you see that this wall doesn't have the sense of three-dimensionality in it, right? Because it's just a two-dimensional texture. Giving the sense of three-dimensionality comes from the normal component of your material. So what you can do is you can go back to your material editor here, and in the material editor, just right-click somewhere in the gray area. From the texture subcategory, again, bring a texture sample, and instead of just a color texture, now we give it a normal texture. To do that, we go back to our content browser, and we choose the normal texture this time, minimize the content browser, and apply the normal texture to the texture sample. This normal texture has the RGB values that if you combine them, it will show you the normal to each surface of that texture, which essentially Unreal turns it into a three-dimensional value. And the alpha value basically is created for the crevices of your texture sample. So if you click on the RGB value and connect it to the normal sample, you automatically see that your object gets a three-dimensional sense. You can change the object from sphere to a square or a cube, and this will give you a better sense of how it looks like. Okay, now let me disconnect the normal, and you see that it's a two-dimensional object. When you connect the normal, just focus in this area, and when you connect the normal texture, you see that your object looks three-dimensional. Now let's zoom in to the wall, and let's rotate a little bit, and then save the settings. I want you to focus on this area in the viewport. When you save the value, your wall looks more three-dimensional now with the introduction of your texture. Now let's just play this level one more time, and here your wall has a lot more three-dimensionality feel to it. Now in the RGB values for your diffuse texture up here, this value essentially has the alpha channel, has the artist that created this material in the alpha channel, they put the constant values for the specular components of the two-dimensional image here. What that means is that for some part of the bricks, you may have water or moisture on them, so they are a little bit more shiny than the rest. So those areas are created in and placed in the alpha channel for your texture sample. Now if you click on the alpha channel and connect it to your specular component of your material, you will see a little bit of shininess in this area. So just notice, focus on this area, and let me just unselect and reselect the specular value, and so you see a little bit of moisture coming off. So this areas of your wall is a bit more shiny. If you apply your changes, you will see that there are some shininess applied on the brick materials. You can change the inputs of each of the expressions by just unselecting them with holding the Alt key and then choosing the appropriate components to your material. Now to show you how to select multiple expressions, you can hold Control and Alt and drag to marquee select your materials or your expressions, and then while holding Control you can move your expressions as you see here. That's another thing that I wanted to show you in terms of the interface of your material expression. Now let's save our materials, And let's look at how the materials look like in the viewport. So basically, this is how your material look in the viewport. And if you play the game, you will see that now your material are a bit three-dimensional because of the texture, because of the normal map. So you see those bumps and those crevices on the material. And also the material looks a bit more moist and shiny because water is on it. So when you move around, you can see that your material has basically come to life in that sense. Now, when you choose a surface, you can manipulate the coordinates, texture coordinates of the surface by clicking on the surface and choosing the surface properties. And as I've shown you earlier, with the surface properties window open, you can pan your texture, look at the texture while I'm pressing on 4, and you see that the material is moving 4 units, 16 units, 64 units along the X direction or U direction, and 4, 16, or 64 along the V texture coordinate. You can rotate your material on the surface, as you see here, by 45 or 90 degrees or custom rotation, or you can flip your texture coordinates. You can change the light mask value for lighting, and that, if you remember from the first chapter, it creates better shadows if you assign lower values for the light mask resolution. Or you can scale your texture. If you use smaller numbers for scaling and click on relative and apply it, your textures become much smaller when applied to your to the wall. And if you choose larger values, they become larger, as you see here. If you uncheck relative, your texture components will be applied or multiplied by the selection value, as you see here. So it will not be relative to the previous size of the texture, but the texture size on your texture map or texture sample. Another way to manipulate your textures on the surface of the materials is to click on texture alignment mode. And as you see here, when you click on texture alignment mode, a two-dimensional axis shows up that lets you move your texture on the surface of your object. You could use this rotation to rotate the texture on the surface of your object. And you could use the scale to scale down or scale up your texture. And then when you're done with your texture alignment, you can go back to your view mode or camera mode, and you'll see your texture on the surface of your objects. Now finally, I want to show you another way to use your normal map if the artist had created the bump offsets for your normal map to even give more three-dimensionality to your materials. Now in this example, or the textures that come with the package with your DVD of the book, the first volume of the book, when the artist created this alpha channel in the normal map, in the alpha channel of the normal map, they place the information for each pixel about the location of that pixel relative to the top of the surface. So what that means is that you can apply this to manipulate the UV coordinate of a different texture sample to give it more three-dimensional looks. So I want you to notice in this area when I add this component. The way to implement this further three-dimensionality on top of your normal map is to right-click in the gray area, and from the utility subcategory, bring a bump offset component. And the bump offset component gets us input coordinates to pan, zoom, or rotate the textures, and a height that for each pixel it applies the height of that pixel in the texture map. And then you can apply that to the UVs of your texture that you want to apply the bump offset. If you do this, notice that your material will be broken and it misses the height input, so it won't show anything as the input. If you apply the alpha component of your texture sample, normal map, to the height of this texture, you will see that it will create the three-dimensional look or further three-dimensional looks to your object. Now, look at this area, and I will unselect the height map. So you see that the map, although it looks three-dimensional, it still looks like it's painted on a two-dimensional surface. When you bring the height map from the bump offset and you connect it to the UVs of your texture, notice that your material looks really 3D now. And if you apply this material, now your material looks a lot more 3D, and you can see what difference it makes. So this height information is also stored in the alpha channel of your texture sample for the normal. Some normal texture samples may have, some may not have this information in their alpha channel. So that really depends on the artist who created the texture for the alpha channel and the normal map here. Okay, now let's play this level one more time and see how it looks like. Okay, now your level really, or your materials really look 3D as seen here. And of course they look shiny because they're moist. That comes from the specular component of your material. And you see the general look of your brick in the normal map and the diffuse map for your texture sample.